Good evening, depending where you are in the world. It's my real privilege to chair this roundtable on behavior and climate change. I'm the chair of the Climate Action Committee for East Penpa, and it's been one of our missions to raise this issue that we all know is pretty important within the agenda of research on climate, on behavior change, but also for physical activity and nutrition more specifically. And we have two really exciting speakers tonight to lead us through some ideas, short presentations, and then we'll debate with them. We'll welcome all of your questions. As probing as you would want to make it, the speakers are ready and they are really fired up and passionate. But before we go on to doing this, I want to remind you, and we'll remind you again at the end, that throughout the whole year, we are inviting the whole of East Penpa community to input into a massive global group model building, looking at how is physical activity linked, what are the causal pathways that might link to carbon emissions, either going up or going down. And we invite you to go there. It's online, it's straightforward. Many people have already contributed. We need to harvest as many ideas and views as possible. You don't have to be a specialist on climate. You don't have to be a specialist on physical activity. We're looking for real, good, reasonable ideas. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jenny Vamos for Arizona State University to tell us about our research.
Awesome. Thank you. I will share my screen. Good. Okay. Looks good.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first kind of involvement with ISBN-PA, but I've heard a lot about it from my colleagues here at ASU. So I'm an associate professor at Arizona State in the School of Sustainability. My background is in atmospheric science, micrometeorology, and then kind of bridging that with human physiology and understanding what happens to the body in extreme heat, especially in urban climates, and what can we do to modify those urban climates to make them cooler, especially in hot places. So today I'll be discussing different forms of heat adaptation for children to support their physical activity in different types of environments. And I always like to acknowledge so many different collaborators and funders on a lot of these projects I'll show you today. And especially the students who are involved, the teachers who help us out, and the community members who share their time with us. So with a lot of this, I mean, we can talk about the problems and motivation around urban growth and climate change and population growth, which we will do. Some of the different research projects, just kind of snippets of them, and some of our engagement with schools and cities, and then some of the solutions that we might apply that really focus more on acknowledging that it's hot, that it's getting hotter for various reasons, and what can we do about it in this face of a changing climate. So problems, thinking about warm weather play, and this is going to differ by country and city and so forth, but playgrounds and schoolyards in general are hot and getting hotter, and we'll dig into that a bit more. Kids are vulnerable to extreme heat exposure. Part of that is sun exposure, and dealing with that sun exposure is a big part of the equation. A lot of the designs for solutions don't really look at heat safety per se. So what can we do to support physical activity while looking at heat safety? So together, these decrease play, especially safe play in outdoor environments. So when we think about heat risk in school children, we do know that there's different physiologic and behavioral factors that increase children's vulnerability to heat. So thinking, and I think the physiologic factors are still being studied because kids are hard to study and get the ethical approval to kind of expose to extreme heat for a long period of time. But we do know behavioral and psychological factors around them just not having the experience of what is it like to start experiencing heat stress? What can we do? What changes in our behavior can occur to try and mitigate this problem from happening, especially if they're unaware of it even happening to them. That's a big part of it. So you can think about education being really important there. We know that high temperatures can affect their behavior in the classroom or afterwards, their ability to play and their learning. And then indoor and outdoor heat is a concern. It really depends on where you are. Here in where we live around Phoenix area, there are rules that state that the indoor air temperature must be below 84 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 28 degrees Celsius. But there's a lot of places around the world that do not have rules like that, do not have air conditioning. And so those indoor temperatures can be a lot higher. And I will say 80 to 28 degrees Celsius is not that hot in Phoenix. But you would see temperatures much lower indoors around 23, 24. So anyways, we also know, especially in Arizona, and I'd love to see more places having this kind of data, but showing that heat-related emergency department visits among children and youth are present, and hundreds of kids going to the emergency departments across the years. And we want to bring that down. We want to be able to understand what's causing this and prevent it through education and safe play in safe areas for play. So like I said, playgrounds are hot spaces. Oftentimes, data across a city might show that the highest temperatures within an urban area can be found on a playground. And we can think about surface temperatures as part of this too, but a higher surface temperature also can increase the air temperature above it. And most playgrounds lack that adequate shade. So what we really want to be thinking about is making sure that our playgrounds are not urban little heat islands within a already present heat island, but that we create playgrounds that are more like park cooling islands that provide a cooler, safer environment and experience for the kids. Some of our research shows the really high temperatures that surfaces reach, especially if they're not shaded. This is from a study in Phoenix finding 80 degrees Celsius rubber temperatures and 71 degrees Celsius slide temperatures. Those temperatures would burn a child's skin about a 2nd degree burn in about 3 seconds. And so what happens is these spaces become unusable if they're not designed properly for the climate in mind. And so we might not see those temperatures in other cities and countries, but it doesn't change the fact that being exposed to the sun in the warm season decreases your comfort and might decrease your play. So knowing the benefits of play, and I probably don't need to say this to this audience, but children get a lot of play at school and during recess. And it's so vital that if we think of any concern that may impact their children's playability, so thinking about heat and environment and air pollution, which I also study, and sunlight or other chemicals, that is a problem for their own human rights. So can we create spaces that are environmentally safe, thermally comfortable, and conducive to active play safely throughout the year? So I'll go into 3 little snippets of studies just to show you some of the methods we use and have used in the past to study this on warm days. So we did a study a long time ago, 2016 in Lubbock, Texas. This is generally a dry, sunny area. All of our studies are always on sunny days so that we can understand how kids are utilizing shade for thermal comfort. We looked at many kids across a few weeks, age 9 to 11, and asked what is the impact of shade on their own personal heat balance, what they report to us as thermal comfort and preference, and on UV radiation during physical activity. And we prescribed their play. So we told them where to play and then asked them thermal comfort questionnaires. So we were able to say, okay, you're going to play this activity in the shade and this activity in the sun for 10 minutes or so. And then we did this multiple times throughout a few weeks on warm, sunny days. So overall, students stated higher levels of comfort in the shade, which was part of our hypothesis. There's no significant difference in overall activity, but that's because we also told them, here's what you kind of should do, but we didn't control their actual metabolic rate. And then they often stated they preferred to be a lot cooler when they were playing in the sun, yet they were kind of okay with it and said they just wanted to keep playing. So this shows this experiential or psychological difference where an adult might say, no, I need to go sit down, take a break, get water, get shade, where kids just wanted to kind of keep playing in the activity they were doing, which is great, but we need to make sure these spaces are providing that. And if you look at this image, this playground has very little shade, and this shade sail here that's present, they actually weren't allowed to use unless they were part of our study. So it's also, some of the spaces are limited for their use. Another study not yet published, but from San Diego, California, looking at kids that were a bit younger, 5 to 9, free play in this space that only had this one little area of shade. And we had sensors on them monitoring their location here. And overall, kids spent about 90% of their free play time in the shade. They had a lower metabolic rate in the shade. And then from some of these results, our hypothesis would be that if we provided more shade, they might get more safe physical activity in these environments. And then the third one, and this is a study with colleagues here at ASU, but looking at how kids are interacting in different zones of a schoolyard with shade and nature. So taking the SoPlay tool and adding the shade and nature interaction component to it. Again, looking at kids of different age groups across multiple recesses of warm, sunny weather. So we found that this is a reliable tool for measuring children's interaction with shade and nature, and that the younger kids, essentially it was kind of correlated with everything, having shade present, but older, we found that they were more sedentary or light physical activity in the shade, which again goes to show that if we were to provide more shade, they might be a little bit more active versus using the shade only for breaks. And again, you can see these spaces do not have much shade. So what can we do about that? And then lastly, I want to mention our program on heat ready schools. We created this in 2021 here, and it's kind of expanding across areas of the state and hopefully the country soon. But these are schools that are increasingly able to identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the negative impacts of schoolyard heat. How does this relate to physical activity? Well, we're trying to ask the question, we know that it can be safe to be active in, or unsafe to be active in heat when it's hot. So what can schools do about that? Can they create better, cooler outdoor designs? Yes. Can they change the use of outdoor space to be the coolest place? Yes. Can they change recess time? Yes. Have indoor physical activity? Yes. So it's kind of all of the above that we try and help and support students and schools to still be able to get that physical activity even on hot days. So with this program, we have a lot of different training and curriculum materials and help schools be more heat ready. And I'll wrap it up with some takeaways here. So heat mitigation does have to go hand in hand with heat readiness. We acknowledge it's warming and we need to do something about those temperatures today or yesterday to make these safer places for kids. But these measurements matter. So having some of these measurements in schoolyards can help schools and school boards and governments with decision making for policy. Shade is, in all of our studies, the most impactful design feature to lessen outdoor heat stress. And it is not advisable to replace shade with reflective coatings in playgrounds, as that will exacerbate their heat stress due to the reflected radiation on their body. So we really need to think about shifting to passive cooling for thermal comfort, blocking that heat and sun for safety, and then heat preparedness in the schools itself. And with that, I will wrap it up and pass it to Christian.
Thank you so much for that, Jenny. Wow, that's some amazing, different, well, anyway, I'll go on with mine in conscious of time. I think we're going to have a lot of synergies at the end of this. So hello, my name is Dr. Christian Reynolds. I'm from the Centre for Food Policy, and I focus on sustainable food systems and food waste. I'm on the board of the Nutrition Society, being the theme lead for food systems, as well as being on the Sustainability Working Group for the Institute of Food Science and Technology. That's just a little bit of a brief introduction to me, as it were. And let's get to the depressing part first. The depressing and thing that we're here to talk about is the climate is changing. The climate has increased since pre-industrial period, and a lot of that, well, that's anthropogenic climate change. The thing I guess that we're now faced with is that climate change is changing the food system, and food production and climate change are linked. So there's this brilliant paper from back in 2013 highlighting the grain baskets of the world and showing that within these places there is climate stress, and that is changing crop yield, and which means there will be changes, and is now showing changes to production. So a decade after this study, we are seeing changes to production already happening, and as well as a weather disruption. However, at the Centre for Food Policy, we take a very long-term view. And the thing is that food and climate have always been linked. And so if you take a much longer view, back to the 1300s to 1800s, there was a period called the Little Ice Age. And within this, there were lots of changes to our food system, our ways of diets, etc. And the thing I want to highlight here within this Little Ice Age, it changed how we as a globe ate the species, the crops, etc. But every time there was a fluctuation in climate, e.g. cooling of 0.5 degrees, shall we say, that caused starvation, it caused famine. And therefore food production and food consumption are linked to climate impacts, and climate impact linked back to climate. And so this all leads to resilient societies, and I know today we're going to be talking about adaptation as well as resilience. But the thing I want to highlight here is that huge changes to Europe and the global food systems due to this Little Ice Age, including increases in dairy production and consumption, changes from rye to wheat, etc., that was due to a 0.5 degree cooling on average over that period of 300 years. With those fluctuations, we're now talking about a 1.1 warmer to 2 degree change. We're talking about a much larger change happening faster. So this is where we're now up to. We have an emissions reduction challenge. We need to be keeping our food system and the wider generation of greenhouse gases within a boundary, but we're also warming. So we need to stabilize what we're producing and reduce further. The good news, however, is that there are two actions that a lot of people have identified that really work in terms of changing the food system. And one of these is shifting towards sustainable diets. The other big one, of course, is reduced food loss and waste. I love that one as well, but we're talking today about this big one here from this report by WRI, World Resources Institute. These are the different things we need to do by 2050 to reduce our climate impacts. However, that's from a system perspective. The other way to look at it is from an individualized perspective. So saying, what do each of us need to do rather than the system need to do? And an amazing project called Project Drawdown highlighted what each of us individually need to do. And again, surprisingly, the two big top 20 climate impacts for households and individuals: one, reduce food waste, and you bet it, two, plant-rich diets. And so this means that we can change the wider system, but we also need to be changing what we're doing as individuals. And that's what I want to talk to you today about. So let's first do some little bit of definitions. I've been working in this space for about 15 years, but I feel now that the Eat Lancet report, printed in 2019, provides a really solid definition for what a sustainable diet within planetary boundaries could look like. Now, there's lots of fine-tuning there, but to me the big things to look at are a massive increase in fruits and vegetables and a massive decrease in animal proteins. So that's animal products variously, but also just the sources of protein being less in animal basis. And that's also, if we're thinking at a global average of 2,500 kilocalorie, 56 grams of protein, and a max of 1.7 kilograms of CO2 per person per day. The average British diet currently, and the US diet and the Australian diets, for instance, they're all around 7 to 10 kilos, depending on what data set you're using. We're talking 1.7 kilos. That's a dramatic shift. And there was a lot of response to that in 2019 when it came out. And a lot of critiques came about it. There was a lack of consideration in the report for local traditional diets, ways of production, and there was very limited suggestions of how we need to get there. But new reports such as the Barilla Foundation One Health Approach to Food actually has 10 separate global dietary patterns that are culturally sensitive and are highlighting what's good for the planet and good for human health and good for animal health as well. So taking a bigger One Health approach. But from my own research, I've been trying to think about how we actually get this message into the communities, doing different research with the wider community. And the first thing I just want to highlight here is that how we cook also matters. It's not just what we eat, it's how we cook and the energy that we use to cook with. So this is a survey done of home cooking methods in the UK, but we also have data on multiple other countries. And so it's highlighting we need to change the recipe, but we also need to change how we cook those ingredients. So it's not just oven baking, it's not just frying on the top. it's using pressure, it's using microwaves, it's using slow cooking, which are all dramatically smaller. And I guess the big thing to highlight here is, say, with potatoes, up to 60% of the environmental impacts of a potato can be in the cooking phase, because you're putting a potato into a roasting tin, versus 1 to 2% if you put it in the microwave. But then also look at these relative bars, you can see that still animal source foods down here, 63 kilos per 63 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions, versus a potato over here, but 2.5 kilos. So even though there's a much bigger percentage of cooking impact from fruits and vegetables, shall we say, overall, there's still a big amount from meat and fish, and we need to be reducing meat and fish. So how we cook and our diets matter. So let's start thinking about operationalizing that for the Eat Lancet. So the Eat Lancet's highlighting 0 to 28 grams of beef, lamb, or pork per day. That says to me that we could be either reducing consumption instances or having smaller portion sizes. So typically 170 to 90 grams of beef once a week, a la the recommended daily portion size in the Eat Well guide of meat. Or we could integrate 28 grams of beef or other sorts of meats into a dish packed full of vegetables in a wok-based method or something like that, which means we're going for a different style of cooking. Finally, we could adapt ultra-processed food trends to be lower emissions. E.g., we blend and have more sustainable protein. So you have meat, say, blended with mushrooms to create a burger that's much lower, lower carbon emissions. Also, the choice of fat really matters. If you're using butter versus oil, there's a huge difference in carbon footprint depending where that butter and depending where that oil is sourced from. Likewise, I just want to highlight in these last few minutes that the dietary patterns of every generation change because of where we shop, how we farm, our own preferences. And so if you think back to the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, we are already eating more sustainably than most generations, the current generations born after the 1970s. We're having less from animal proteins, more from more fruits and vegetables than ever before. So we are winning in certain ways, but the challenges are still there. We have ultra-processed foods that, though low in impact, have their own health complications. We need to be balancing out and thinking about these wider aspects. And I guess I just want to highlight here that there are lots of different pathways to a healthy, sustainable, low-carbon diet. So this is a great piece of research by Jenny McDermott up in Aberdeen, highlighting that this is from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, looking at the population, how much greenhouse gas emissions they have per day versus their healthy diet index score. So you can see here down on the bottom right, low greenhouse gas healthy diets. But there needs to be different interventions for high greenhouse gas healthy diets versus low greenhouse gas unhealthy diets. There needs to be different interventions. And luckily, people have been thinking about that. A brilliant report came out in 2020, just as lockdown hit, so everybody missed it, but it's a brilliant report called A Menu for Change, and it highlighted 12 different strategies for promoting sustainable diets. So taxes, plant-based food shifts, promotions, norm shifting, eco-labels, supermarket changes, recipes, editing choice architecture. Lots of different things that we can try, and the research community more broadly is now trying. So I just want to highlight also that lots of amazing people are doing research in this area, and we cannot stop the climate crisis alone. But shout out to an amazingly supportive and diverse range of researchers across the UK and the globe. We're sharing research. Please do engage with us. We love the nutrition community. And again, let us beat this together and work towards a more sustainable diet together. So I'm Christian from the Centre for Food Policy. Thank you very much.
Christian and Jenny, thank you very, very much. Two really, really thought-provoking talks here. So what I'm going to do now is just to open up the floor to any of our attendants that might have direct questions about the talks we've just seen. And then we'll try to open that to a more of a debate and roundtable afterwards. But let's take a few questions. Don't hesitate to ask, raise your hand, and I will give you the or your virtual hand, and we'll give you the microphone. Or if you're too shy to ask, just type them in the chat and I'll relay these questions to our speakers. I'm going to give you a second or two to think about questions. Right. that's about 2 seconds, and I have no questions from the floor just immediately. So let me start. Christian, I'm less familiar with your research, so I'm going to start with you. So it's really interesting, it's fascinating. It's both about what we consume and how we consume it. But there's one thing that seems to be missing for me in that talk is if I eat more vegetables, great, but does it not depend where these vegetables come from?
Really good question, and I missed that slide out of the talk because I was trying to keep it to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I guess the two narratives are, A, vegetables and plant-based proteins are lower regardless of where they come from and how they're transported. Transport emissions are only 5 to 10% of an emission of a product, regardless of where it's from. If it's flown, so Peruvian asparagus flown over, that's a high emission per kilogram. But overall, animal-based proteins, as I gave in that example, are 65, say, kilos of CO2 versus no, that's wrong. About 28 kilos of CO2 to a vegetable being 0.5 to 3 kilos of CO2 per kilo of vegetable. So you're talking a very different amount of environmental impact for those, regardless of where it's produced. The modes of production, so a tomato grown in a hothouse versus a tomato grown in a field, can matter. But again, you're talking tomatoes versus tomatoes, not tomatoes versus a steak.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what I find fascinating about the way you talk about this is you use relative terms, and I find that really helpful when it comes down to thinking about this climate emissions. So in terms of physical activity, we know that, for example, a human can do about 100 kilowatt hour and has about 62 kilogram worth of CO2 emitted, but it's 100 times less than the energy we can use from 1 liter of petrol. And so that giving these scales is really important. So if I hear you right, if I have the choice between an avocado from Mexico or a beef from Lancashire, living in the UK, I should go with the avocado from Mexico. And if I have then a chance to have an avocado from somewhere in the UK, that would be the best choice.
I think there's more to the discussion than just climate. And that's where I talk about or research the Centre for Food Policy. It's thinking about this in a coherent strategy in terms of, are we talking about rural communities, and are you replacing that avocado nutritionally in your diet with, that piece of land nutritionally with that avocado, because they're not equal calorie for calorie. A probably better example would be a BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich, and replacing the bacon in it with avocado. So that would be a more culinary use, and an avocado there would be 1.8 to 3 kilograms versus the bacon, which would be 6 kilograms to 9 kilograms. So again, that's thinking of the culinary equivalent and probably the same weight equivalent of products that you'd have. I don't know how you like your BLT, but that might be a better example than saying a Lancashire farmed piece, because that has a lot of dimensions regarding rural communities, and also talking about rural communities in Peru or wherever the avocado is from as well. And that's a different justice and equity and inclusion question to just changing your diet for carbon. It's really complex.
Yes, so we're talking about many other things that are linked to this, and it is why this kind of systemic approach is so important here. But let's try to simplify it a little bit in places if we can. So just to get a handle on it for those of us that are not so versed as you are into this. So the food mile is the problem, the cooking is a problem, and what we're eating is a problem. But now the question is what it is that we can do as individuals compared to, so you did that really well in your talk, compared to what can we do at a systemic level. How much impact am I going to have as a person changing my personal behavior compared to governments deciding to taxing meat, or subsidizing vegetables more, or something like that, or any other measures that are really going to change things on a large scale?
I think they are two very different things, which is why I highlighted them that way. In terms of individual change, yes, shifting towards a vegan or vegetarian, or even just doubling your fruits and vegetables and halving your animal proteins will have a dramatic shift of your individual footprint. However, lobbying as well. And if I'm being brutally honest, the other big thing you do is change to a renewable energy supplier, because that'll change your cooking impacts and will have another big shift. So it's not just about diet, it's about the food environment and changing those things. Again, this is complicated. This is why there's a lot of contention there.
Yeah, so but I'm going to still probe you about this, because there are both political things and ethical things with this. So some governments might be actually leaning toward pushing the public to change their behavior without not actually attending to any of the other things. So if I have to put my energy into something, do I have to put my energy into lobbying and doing something about this, or should I do it in changing my own diet and probably learning to cook new things in a new way and transforming my home? I mean, I'm sure we all have to do these things at some point, but it's whether, I mean, for a professor like you, it's probably easy, but so for somebody that is less well off, the true choices they have on what they can buy at what price is a lot more complicated.
Definitely, but I think, okay, if you have one option to do, it's do the thing that you enjoy, because then you're actually going to do it and keep your behavior change consistent and going. That said, if you enjoy recycling versus shifting your diet and eating a few more vegetables, the diet shift and eating vegetables will be a triple to 5 times the impact of you actually doing your recycling properly. So there is information out there about these. Project Drawdown is brilliant at highlighting that in terms of reducing your food waste, changing towards a plant-based diet. Those are actions that people can take at the individualistic level. If you like writing to your MP, if you like lobbying, if you do those sorts of things, that is also quite a powerful thing, but it takes time and is indirect. And we are trying to assure at the Centre for Food Policy that it does not lead to negative health or other negative consequences in terms of policy incoherence in specific areas.
Thank you. Let's explore this a little bit more, in a sense that let's shift to a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. And you showed really, really clearly how we can, shift toward, I've even heard the term protein transition. So changing our protein sources, and they are a trend, and it's a great trend with some really interesting products that are vegan products that look like meat and they have the texture of meat, and this has improved. I mean, this has changed dramatically compared to I don't know if you had that in other part of the world, but we had a burger mix in the UK, which was an absolutely horrible thing to swallow and cook. But now they are pretty convincing vegetarian burgers or even vegan burgers that do have the texture of meat and everything like this. So those are obviously super processed. So should we go for this? What is the science behind that in terms of, because we've seen great research coming recently around how super processed food might affect our health in rather interesting ways.
Thank you. I'll answer that and just link to one of the questions in the chat about socioeconomic gradients. So we've done work, or myself and collaborators in Brazil and also in the UK, looking at ultra-processed food consumption and greenhouse gas emissions across the socioeconomic spectrum. And then my work in terms of optimizing every person's diet within those different socioeconomic spectrums to see what they would need to move towards healthy, sustainable diets. In terms of ultra-processed food, I recognize, as I showed in that graph, that some sorts of ultra-processed food enable shifts towards a lower footprint diet. However, some other forms of ultra-processed food are just empty calories, as it were, and are equivalents in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. There are tensions there. But equally, the big thing we found in our research is just increasing fruits and vegetable consumption versus some of the higher footprint things to increase satiety and overall just keeping the footprint lower while keeping the positive health outcomes. So I think in terms of the easiest intervention we could do, which is hopefully affordable, it's increasing legumes and increasing one portion of fruit and veg a day, if that's possible within the population.
Superb. And we have some really nice, interesting questions in the chat, one particularly about socioeconomic gradients. So I'm going to let you introduce that, Christian. And then I'm going to probably then let you just go and ask a question to Jennifer. In particular, at the beginning, you said there are plenty of synergies, and maybe you can highlight the synergies for us. and let Jennifer explain where she sees them as well.
Okay. Well, I guess what really excited me about Jennifer's talk is I'm from Australia originally, and I dealt with hot playgrounds my entire growing up life. And so I was nodding vigorously throughout the entire talk, thinking about school meals out on hot tarmac, because we ate outside in the sun, and you jostled for space under the shade cloth. And I just thought, in terms of the different sorts of behavioral intervention within a school environment, it was fascinating looking at both playground and school and the behavioral changes within that. So I guess the question I was wanting to ask was, within you mentioned on your last slide, the heat smart school. Is there additional funding for that, and what actually changes within the school environment because of that?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good question. And I do see a lot of the thinking about behavioral adaptation, acknowledging that we need to do that across different realms. So food, dealing with heat, dealing with other environmental extremes is definitely important. And that's educating people on what to do so that they know the right decisions to make. So that's part of Heat Ready Schools. And so with Heat Ready Schools, I just mentioned kind of one little facet of it around how are we supporting schools to still achieve some physical activity goals for their students. But there's actually, for the schools, up to about 30 recommendations per school that might revolve around training, education, policy that they could make. So having a formal policy on how to make changes, having more passive cooling available, water available, hats, sunscreen, all those kinds of things that schools can implement. Some of them are easier to implement. Some of them schools are already doing, which is great. Some of them are harder to implement. And that's where we would come in and try and work with the schools to say, let's get your tree coverage up. How can we find some trees? Who can we work with? So there's a Trees for School program here with an NGO called Trees Matter. And so we'll connect the school with Trees Matter to come in and figure out what trees can be planted where that fit with the climate and the water needs or restrictions to still provide those trees in really strategic places. And so that can overlap with thinking about where space is being used. A lot of schools want outdoor classrooms now, so we can tell them where are good spots for outdoor classrooms for different times of the year. A lot of schools started having lunches outside during COVID. And we helped the school kind of create this nature cafe with shade and trees and umbrellas so that the kids could eat outside in the shade. So that was a big part of just thinking about some of the adaptations in place. That's a lot of kind of the Heat Ready Schools program. And you could do some kind of similar techniques around thinking about how food is provided at schools. And a lot of the schools here provide food to the kids. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in how that food is provided.
Thank you, Jenny. That leads us on to one really nice question from our audience as well, which was asking you whether you know of some research that kind of compared the advantages of shade versus kind of natural sources of cooling down. And I was particularly interested in your slide around cooling islands, which might be possible in some places, but places like Phoenix, to keep these cooling places, that's going to consume a vast amount of energy and probably water resources.
Yeah, so that's where you need to think about these kind of bioclimatic attributes of a place and what kind of trees can be grown. Can grass really be grown sustainably? And in some places, no, you have to use other surfaces. And so we try and look at that and think what natural surfaces can be used that aren't going to get as hot as something like asphalt and concrete that will still support tree growth. So you can think wood chips and sand and just dirt is fine. Kids want to play in dirt and it doesn't get as hot as something like asphalt and concrete that also are not going to support the growth of trees. But yeah, thinking about this, I mean, in Phoenix, we kind of have this saying of the right shade in the right place. And so you cannot put trees everywhere. And this is not just in schoolyards, but this is thinking about across a city. And there's a lot of restrictions around where trees can grow, with visibility and water lines and power lines in the ground, and just what can grow where properly. And so the cities spend a lot of time on this, and then we can also use that knowledge with schools to figure out where the best spots to put what trees in the right place. And if that's not possible because of different restrictions, what kind of other shade can be used? So number one, there's already a lot of building shade available. Or when we build something, we can strategically place play spaces in the shade of those buildings, depending on the time of day we want to be using that space. That's really helpful, but most schools are already built that we're working with, so we have to work within, what we have here. So how can we use this enclave? How can we use this space? What kind of we call lightweight engineered shade, so like those shade sails can be put in place. The American Cancer Society here has free shade sail program for schools, so we help schools get involved with that. And just thinking more strategically around what kind of shade. Now, in terms of what's most impactful related to Kylie's question, we do find that building shade, or like really like 100% shade coverage, which a tree doesn't always provide, is the best overall on average type of shade. However, it can be more expensive. And then shade itself is not going to decrease the air temperatures. It will decrease your mean radiant temperature that you feel from the sun. So how much sunlight you're absorbing as a person. Trees can also help lower the air temperature because of evapotranspiration. But that's where your question on water use is really important, to consider which trees can be supported that will actually provide that cooling. So there's a lot of considerations depending on where you are doing this. Much more difficult to have these nice lush forests in Phoenix versus a place like Ottawa that you can have these nice lush forests, and then you might be thinking about other strategies to decrease the humidity there because it's much more humid there than in Phoenix. So you need to have the airflow, which we don't worry about humidity much in Phoenix. So that's thinking like, how does bioclimatic design affect a person's thermal comfort?
Thank you very much, Jenny. And I think what's amazing about both your talks and the way you're developing these answers is about the complexity of what we're dealing with. And we used to have such a reductionist approach to things, especially in nutrition and physical activity. Is this better than this? Is 30 minutes better than 27 minutes or something like that? And actually, what you're teaching us here is that there's so many other things we have to think about. So we have to maybe stop being dinosaurs and just approaching things in a more kind of open and opening ourselves to complexities. So for the younger members of the audience that are entering into research, don't be a dinosaur. Don't be like me, basically, and embrace this kind of thinking. But Jenny, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of transform one of the question that was asked to Christian about socioeconomic status and social need gradients, and ask you about how does that impact schools and shading, and if you've noticed things like this. Because with food, we kind of understand that, and we can maybe have an appreciation that might be the case, that better schools are in more wealthy areas. But in terms of shading, in terms of resilience to heat, how is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we can think about schools in lower socioeconomic areas. We can also just think about across a city. What do we see in terms of the difference of shade provision and other types of amenities that support staying cool? And we actually just wrote a comment piece in Nature on shade deserts, where we kind of introduced this term shade deserts related to socioeconomic status. So it's not too much different than food deserts, right? We kind of stole the term. So there's some like overlap here with Christian. But thinking about why are certain areas of cities lacking shade tremendously, while other areas of cities have an abundance of shade? And a lot of that comes down to one of the reasons could be thinking about redlining historically, especially in American cities, where a lot of areas of cities were disinvested in the past. And there's now these historical legacies that are still affecting people today. So cities need to start reversing that and think about shade equity. So that means building up those places, much, much more resources into those places for shade provisioning across different types of shade, so that they can eventually equal what's in some higher socioeconomic areas. In these higher socioeconomic areas too, we see that a lot of people have more time and money to support tree growth, whether it's on their property or not on their property. So we have to remember the city only controls so much of the land to be able to implement shade. And then we have to rely on individual landowners and then private industry and landowners to implement shading. And so we have to kind of work together across those realms. So we do see that those areas, we need to invest more in these areas that have lacked it in the past. We also see, though, those areas are very paved over. So the investments are almost double because we've paved over the areas and need to remove that pavement and figure out how to fit trees into these tiny little places. And so it's not just trees, it's being able to have shaded bus stops to support people who are more exposed to the heat, and also utilizing building shade more in kind of denser cities, because those buildings do provide really nice shade in an urban canyon that does keep heat exposure and temperatures down. And then the last thing I want to say is we're trying to get funding to look to see if there's differences by socioeconomic status in schools, to see how much physical activity is supported, and then also differences in shade across the school. And so that our hypothesis is that lower socioeconomic status would then of an area would indicate a school having less shade available for the students, which then, of course, for students with lower SES, they might really rely much more tremendously on getting that physical activity at school versus after school sports. And so it's just this amplifying thing if they're not getting that at school because it's too hot outside. So those are some of the factors we think about with this problem.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm going to extend that a little bit, a bit more. We've got a really nice question from Stephanie Prince. Beyond the schoolyard, are you aware of any other kind of climate adaptive intervention that also are synergistic with increasing physical activity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so when I think about climate adaptation in general, I start to think about 4 buckets. So the behavioral changes that people can make, the technology changes that people or society is making, infrastructural changes that you would see in a city to support climate adaptation, and then physiological. So when we think about heat, then there's various ways we could look into those 4 buckets and say, across a city, what ways can a city support heat adaptation? And then it can be individual too. So if we think about one of the easier ones, physiologically, we can acclimatize throughout the summer and become more resilient to the heat just physiologically. But that requires exposing ourselves safely to the heat. But teaching people to do that can be really important. And then they won't feel so awful in the heat when they are in the heat. So just first and foremost, allowing people to safely acclimatize is important. That's one form of adaptation. The second thing about infrastructure, and so we just talked a lot about that and what cities can do to implement areas where there's cooler spots that support physical activity, or trails that are cooler that support physical activity. Again, that's going to look different depending on the climate zone you're in. But here I know in the summer, if I'm going to go for a run, I know I'm going to go to a shaded trail if I can find one. And I'm going to change my behavior and go in the morning or in the night because it's just too hot in the day. So that's the other one, is behavior change. So how are we changing our behavior with the weather in place? And lots of people do this, but we do find that there's people who just don't have the ability to change it because their schedule is set. And then that's when there could be concerns around unnecessarily exposing yourself to dangerous temperatures. Can you change your workout? Can you change where you do your workout in the city so that it's cooler? And then that's where we're going to start to see people going indoors a little bit more during these hot times, to, if there's air conditioning available, to get out of the heat and do some physical activity. And so that can links to the technology. And air conditioning is the #1 heat mitigating technology, but we can't air condition everywhere. So we do have to think about these abilities to support physical activity outdoors. I think that just thinking about people walking to work and walking to school, there's a lot of effort on creating cool corridors here so that we understand where's the foot traffic the highest and how can we support cool corridors to these places. And so you can think about cool corridors to school or cool corridors to the bus or train stop. That's prioritizing people hour exposures, and that's really valuable too, I think.
Thank you, Jenny. And that leads me to another question: is can we actually learn certain things about places in the globe, maybe like Australia, or maybe further afield that have been exposed to heat much more for a longer period of time, and kind of ancient wisdom? Is there such thing that we can tap into, or even we can think about tribal wisdoms in some parts of the world that have been under heat stress for a long period, where people have survived and sometimes thrived. So can we learn from that?
Sure, for sure. And there's probably ways we can do the same in the food and agriculture, learning how one place has grown food in this climate, and as climates are changing, you might need to start doing that in other places. And we already have to do that in some areas. But anyways, for thinking about heat, vernacular architecture is a very common one we think about. So thinking about what color are our houses? How do we build our houses? Where do we have certain air vents or evaporative cooling, depending on the type of climate. And so I think if you go to Greece, all the houses are white, and that's because it's trying to reflect the radiation back out into space, similar with roofs being white. And then you can see different types of features depending on airflow to allow venting into the house, so that indoor spaces can still be kept cooler, even during hot weather. So I think there's a lot of traditional knowledge that can be used more, and I think sometimes we see this in large cities. We're kind of forgetting about that and just designing things that we think look pretty and nice, but that doesn't mean they're going to be functional under different types of weather extremes. And so that's kind of the number one thing I think about in terms of this type of architecture and the past knowledge we can gain. Even the way we orient a house and where we put the shade and where we put the trees and where we put the wind breaks. It all kind of comes into play in how someone will feel around a house or an apartment building, and encouraging people and cities and businesses to be using this kind of knowledge can go a really long way to keeping temperatures down and using less air conditioning, which then limits the amount of heat waste into the urban environment.
Brilliant. I'm going to turn to Antonio because he's put an interesting question in the chat. So he might as well ask him himself.
Thanks, Seth. So it's sort of related to the question that Rick Rosenkrantz included. It's if you know any studies that use a systems approach to tackle this issue, both on physical activity, nutrition, and also both at the individual, policy, or environmental levels, and the results, if you know about that.
Shall I go forward? Is that okay, Jenny? If so I will admit that I am less au fait with physical activity research in this area. The only thing I could think of off the top of my head, so I was a technical specialist before I was at City University at the Waste Resources Action Programme. It's a global NGO looking at circular economy, but we partnered with the City of London and 9 other cities across Europe to do something called Trifocal, which was both about food loss and waste, as well as about healthy sustainable eating. And within the healthy part of healthy sustainable eating, we engaged schools, community groups, etc., to engage in physical activity, walking to work groups, work walks, as well as lunches and things like that. So it was a multiple cities approach, trying to get multiple behaviors simultaneously via engaging at the institutional level, the local government, national government, and community group, school, etc. So it's trying to hit those different points. I'll put the doobly-doo in the website. But that's the only thing I can think off the top of my head with little forewarning.
Jenny, do you want to answer this as well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to try. I can't think of too many either off the top of my head. I mean, when we work with schools, we're incorporating like what can individuals do, teachers, students, the administration, what policies could they make? Although I mean, they can only control that. And then what environmental strategies can they put in place? So I guess, yes, but we don't really say like we're approaching it with the systems thinking, although maybe we could or should try and put that kind of framing on it. And then I don't really know about anything with physical activity. It probably exists. I'm just kind of unaware of it. Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I mean, part of it too is thinking about who sets the rules. And so with schools, it can kind of be school districts, but this is going to differ by state and country or province. So it's understanding like the kind of what the governance structure looks like. Here too, we can have charter schools and private schools where they set the rules, and so they can just create their own policy, where if we work with a large school district, it's much harder actually, but then they can make an impact on many, many more schools than just one. So that's part of thinking, how the entangling, and I think that brings in strategic thinking as well into how do we strategize around making these changes across different systems. So, but it's very tough.
Christian, you want to react to that?
Oh, no, it was just, so Jenny said governance, and I think that's a really important thing in terms of there's the livable cities movement, the 20-minute city movement. There's lots of different local government and state or national governments who are really working towards both having active cities, shaded cities, cool cities, or resilient cities, as well as having dynamic local food plans. And so, you know, there are multiple offices, but sometimes they're not speaking to each other, and so there is conflict between different things. So I definitely remember, say, in Australia, there was you had to have physical activity in the before 10 a.m. because it got too hot, but you had to have maths before 9:30, and you had to have a snack at some point before 10 a.m. and, you know, a fruit snack. And so there were multiple interventions by the government who hadn't really realized that each department had said schools need to do something. And so I think there is a coherence issue that we always need to think about. But totally, there's, as Jenny said, it's governance, and these local places are where the power is right now, I feel, for the adaptation of climate.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I'm going to have to bring this to a close. And again, thank you both for really fascinating and thought-provoking talks. But before we go, I'm going to ask you both to give us one piece of wisdom for the younger members of the audience about how could they integrate these ideas of climate in their own research. So one piece of wisdom.
That's a hard one.
Yeah, I kept it
No
for
stress.
Something that I've learned that I think is really important, I don't know, you know, it doesn't connect directly to climate and climate change, but it connects to working with different types of communities on whatever climate issue is affecting them. And that just build relationships, build trust, give yourself time to do that, and listen. Because we don't have the answers. And oftentimes it's just really based on what system they're working within, so that then maybe some of our expertise could help. But we don't know that till we listen for a while and then build that trust. And so it can take many years to do that, or make sure if you're joining in on a project, understand what's happening. And even when we work with communities, we need to understand the historical nature of what they've dealt with in the past. Because a lot of people we work with might have been here for 50 years, you know, or more their whole life. They know a lot more about heat in Phoenix than me. And so it's listening and learning. And that's where kind of some of the traditional knowledge comes into. So that would be my piece of advice.
Christian, do you have something different?
Short and sweet. I think it's reflecting that perfect is the enemy of good in our research. And so in the last 10 years, we've known so much more data about food, about diet, about ways to measure shade, about ways to measure heat. We have bigger data sets than we did a decade ago. We know so much more, and are already influencing policy in a much better and more integrated way. So starting your research and even just thinking, okay, I want to look at sustainability and within my nutritional physical activity research, how do I integrate it into my food frequency questionnaire, etc. Reaching out to the bigger community and just trying to do it is half the battle, because we need to change rapidly by 2030, by 2050. And without us just trying to do it, we're definitely not going to get there. And we are a community and can work together on that. And that includes our stakeholders, as Jenny said. She's totally right.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. And thank you very much to ISBNPA and to the XChange committee for allowing us to have such fantastic roundtable discussion this evening or this morning, depending where you are. We should do that more often. And I certainly will invite you both again to do that in the future, if you don't mind. We're thinking of having series around these. So again, thank you very much. And Antonio has very kindly put our little slide in the chat. Please do come and join us on this group model building so that we can try to understand a bit better as a collective, as our two speakers have highlighted to us. We have to understand that from a bigger perspective, and we have to work together so we can hatch some sort of plan for the whole of the ISBNPA membership to try to learn more and be more effective and doing something positive. On this note, I'm going to love you and leave you. Thank you both. Thank you, XChange.
Yeah. And for everyone, so I'm going to open some breakout rooms. You can select one and network, but the presenters, please join the one that's named next session presenters, join this one. Okay, and we'll see each other in 13 minutes. Okay, bye-bye.